And I consider my peer group a mix of Indigenous people, but also healthcare workers who are very cutting edge and maybe a little bit edgy. So I think the topic that we're going to consider today is about reaching out to a population that doesn't get reached out to a lot. In my previous work, I was the Deputy Provincial Health Officer for British Columbia, and we would plan health for British Columbians. And literally, a minister that I was working with, we were talking about transgendered surgeries and that we were going to pay for them. He didn't like that. He said, "Really? We're in charge of this?" And I said, "Yes, sir. We look after all British Columbians." And I didn't say, not just the ones that you like. We look after all of them. And it was actually a really important moment in that I saw from his dysfunction and his prejudice and his lack of care that I really needed to care. I really needed to do what I could. So today I'm presenting to you on one eye forward, one eye back, and I purposely put this, it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I don't really know if looking forward and looking back is like within, is something that we really think about. So many of us have such a literal sense of our vision. But I think perhaps it's traditional to look forward and look back at the same time. Just to give you an example, my oldest son loves to play video games in the basement. He's like a lot of young people. And so when my father, his grandfather, comes over, I have to say, can you put your games away? And he's almost a man. I consider him a man. He's old enough to be a man. Can you put your things away? Your grandfather is here. And he's a little bit slow sometimes, which really makes me angry. And so I said to my dad, I said, my son is not very fast to put these things away. And it's such a modern thing. Like, we didn't have that when I was a kid. And I find it really kind of disgusting. What should I do? And he said, well, in our way, and he told this wonderful story of how an eagle has babies and builds a beautiful nest. And he said, and if the baby eagle won't fly, the eagles will destroy their nest. So it must fly. And he said, so you know what you must do? And I literally said, but do you know how hard it is to take my nest apart? Can I just, can I just let him sleep? Can I let him play games? Can I just, be a very tolerant, liberal, gay parent? He said, no. Our way is our way. You can't make it up. You have to learn it. And it really struck me that our way is not just my way. It's our way. And we have a collective knowledge. And for us as Aboriginal people, it's very real. I don't know how real it is for some of you here, but for me, it's extremely real. It's this wonderful inheritance that's timeless and priceless. And I thought, okay, so my father said, I can shake him out of this. But looking forward, looking back, is it painful or is it ecstatic? For Indigenous people, we have a painful past. It's very apparent to us. I think many of us as Indigenous people grew up very poor, with lots of challenges and lots of things that we struggle with. Or is looking forward and looking back a very beautiful thing, a very brave and noble thing? And is looking forward and looking back kind of whimsical? Is it comparing our beautiful inheritance to kind of a modern pop culture? I'm not sure. Or is it beautiful? And does it give us hope? Or is it self-reflection? Is really looking forward and looking back a look inward and a look outward at the same time? And all of you come from cultures where you've inherited knowledge. All of you have inherited ideas from your parents and your grandparents that may or may not be important to you. What do you do with them within a modern context? And I think of HIV, And I think of two-spiritedness as having a very modern component to them, though they are age-old in some ways, and we'll talk about that. A modern component of that we have to figure out. We didn't have them before. What do we do with them now? So, two-eyed seeing, I think, is something that maybe some of you have heard from Albert Marshall, a Mi'kmaq elder from the Eskasoni First Nation, talks about seeing with an indigenous eye and a Western eye simultaneously. You go into a forest, you see the birch, the maple, the pine, but you look underground and all those trees are holding hands. And we as people must do the same, that we're different and we're the same. And to highlight our differences, of course, racially or ethnically or even genetically, we can consider ourselves distinct from each other. But we're in the same forest and we grow from the same medium. So what does that mean? In my language, our word for tree is jeja. And jeja is the same word as for cousin. And so when we see the forest, when we see the trees, and we say jeja, it's a very beautiful and warm feeling. The trees to us are our family, they're our friends. The forest to us is a family place. It's a place where we feel warmth and connection. And it's different than tree in English, which can be a thing that you cut down and then sell for profit on an open market. Or maybe a tree has some other meaning for you. But certainly that idea of tree is one that's one that I've heard. Seeing from a different perspective, here this cartoon says, the radio saying non-white babies now outnumber white babies in America for the first time, and the indigenous elder says second. And I work a lot with doctors, and for them this can be a little bit of a challenge, that their privileged worldview of Canada as a new country, a new place, where Aboriginal people, their poor second cousins, are largely invisible and live on the margins of their lives and realities, when to us, white doctors live in our territories, and they're welcome here, but they're not always aware of us. This is Ayus. Ayus is an island in my territory. It's called Savory Island in English. And Savory Island is a wonderful representation to me of Canada. One half of Savory Island, like if you cut this island along its long spine, has been cut into these 3,000 postage-sized stamp pieces of real estate, some of the most expensive real estate in the country, because this island is called the Hawaii of British Columbia. It has long, white, sandy beaches that go out forever. You can walk out 50 meters and still just be up to your waist in this beautiful white sand. The other half of Savory Island, or Ayus, is still in our possession as Tla'amin people, and is completely undeveloped. There isn't even a clearing for you to put a tent, let alone a sewage system or a water system. There are absolutely no houses there on our side. And these two sides of the island are like two solitudes. The white people don't go over to the Indian side because they're not sure whether they can do that. In fact, it used to be illegal for generations for white people to go on reserve. And vice versa, it was actually illegal for Native people to go off reserve unless they had a pass. And on the other side, Native people don't go into people's backyards, even though that's been our territory for, well, a few hundred generations. We don't go there today because people's houses are there. And we know that the modern viewpoint is, this is my private land, no one's allowed on it. This is an island with limited resources, as in it has a water table, but it's a very shallow water table, and the island is always on water restrictions. You have to be careful about your water usage on this island. And I think as neighbors, how do you share that water? Or do you fight over it, like some places where the reserve and the municipality fight over the water system and the water source? In some places they share it and they're good friends. In other places, one owns it and the other borrows it. And many of you have heard of the idea of water as a right as opposed to a commodity. So how can you own it? It's like owning the air. But here, ideally, they would share something like water. And imagine if there was a care center on this island, where would that care center be? Would it be on the white side, or would it be on the First Nation side? And who would it serve? So, First Nations people have a distinct viewpoint. I grew up in a very, very beautiful territory, and in a modern way, like with one eye, I was very poor. I was poor as any Indigenous person. But in another way, looking back, I was rich. I had a father who was very traditional. English was his second language. He didn't learn English until he was a teenager. I grew up in the bush. He took me in the bush all the time. When my father married my mother had been to residential school her entire life, from 3 until she was 18. And she didn't speak our language, and when he married her, my father was raised by his grandmother, who didn't speak English and was very traditional. He brought her home, and he asked my mother, she was 18, to cook him fish head soup. Fish head soup is a boiled fish head. That's all. She didn't know to take the gills out. And so on that first meal, she left the gills in. And my grandmother said to my dad, "Where did you find such a stupid woman? She doesn't even have a child's knowledge of this place." And so my father, when I was growing up, said he didn't want his children to be useless in their own territory. He said, "It's great if they can read a book, but this is where they live. They need to know the fish and the land and the animals, and they need to have our knowledge of this place." Because Indigenous knowledge really is very much sometimes a local knowledge. And so I grew up, he would pull me from school all the time, and he knew that I was good at school. He would pull me from school all the time and say, "We're going here, there, and everywhere, and you're going to learn to be a man." He didn't say an Indigenous man. He said, "You're just going to learn to be a man. You're going to learn to do the things that any man should know, should have." And it was very funny being a two-spirited kid and having a dad. Well, I guess maybe that's a lot of our experience, when your dad wants to turn you into a man. And I'm really glad he did. He did not raise me with a gentle hand, but he had some very good and clear ideas about what men do. So we had this wealth. We have this wealth as Indigenous peoples. We have this territory. And hopefully for the Indigenous people here, you're still connected to your homelands and your home communities and your territories, and you get home. I know that's not necessarily everyone's experience as Indigenous people, but I hope you get home. And I'll talk about the idea of your home as a resource later. I'm just going to keep moving. This is my great-grandfather. His name was Atam, or Charlie Adams. He was born in 1860. This is a picture of him from 1930. He was 70 years old. He was dementing. He was admitted to hospital. And I don't know why, but the hospital took his picture on admission. So this photo from 1930, 85 years ago, my great-grandfather, and the physician who was admitting him examined him and said that he was scarred from head to toe. And I thought, he was someone beating on him. And, I didn't think about it too much, except feeling sad for this life long gone. And then I remembered, I'm a public health physician, and I learned about the smallpox epidemic of 1862, 2 years after he was born. His village, like all the First Nations villages from San Francisco to Alaska, were ravaged by a smallpox epidemic that killed a third of our people. And between 5 and 10% of people with smallpox are blinded, and he was famously blind. My father would hear stories that his grandfather was a blind woodcutter. His job was to cut wood in the forest. He'd have to be led out there by his children, and they would leave him in the forest, and he would cut whatever he could feel. That was his work. And in the census of 1911 and 1921, he's listed as a woodcutter. But so here is, in my own family tree, a survivor of smallpox. His village, called Comox, was destroyed in that smallpox epidemic. It was abandoned, as were many villages. And he came to the reserve that we live in now, called Slammin. And so this idea, this idea of outbreak is actually quite an old one. This idea of new diseases, that we don't have animals that hunt us. We have little tiny microorganisms that hunt us. And so here's my great-grandfather, a survivor of a great pandemic, and I get to see him, and I'm so grateful. These are my parents, and I'm the little boy in my dad's lap, and there are my 4 sisters. And one of my sisters passed away, my sister Janice, and I show this because I think it's important for us to tell stories of where we work from, to be completely transparent and honest and respectful of others. We need to position ourselves. And the death of my sister, she was 8 and I was 5. She was shot by the boy next door accidentally, and she died in front of me. But it really was a moment that galvanized me. I knew even as a 5-year-old that this shouldn't happen. I knew that children should not be shot. I knew that children should not have guns. I knew that, as she lay dying, that there should have been a policeman there. I knew that an ambulance should come. And later on, when I look back at how all of us, all these Indians on this reserve, with very little infrastructure, there's almost nothing on reserves except houses, even today. So this was in the 60s, there was hardly anything. And I kept thinking, it's not supposed to be this way. Someone's supposed to help. Like, we should be organized enough that someone's there. My family was quite hurt by this event. But people helped us. People helped us a lot. And it wasn't the health system that helped us. It was us. It was my village. And so, to me, the idea of primary care, the care that happens within a community, apart from the healthcare system, apart from primary health care, is very real. Aboriginal people have always looked after themselves. How much do we add to it? We as workers. I always tell people the happy side of this, because I think telling only sad stories is a deception. It's a overdrama. That we all work in helping professions now, my entire family. When I was young, my father would bring me to all the elders. That was what you did as a young person. And this elder never went to residential school. Her mother said, the Creator gave me children to raise. I didn't like the idea of anyone doing it for me. And so they went on the run. If you lived on the reserve, they would take your children and they would be institutionalized in residential school. But her mother, or her parents, went on the run in the bush when it came fall time. So I said to her, what was it like? What was it like growing up without school? And she said, literally, verbatim, we had nothing to do but help the people. And her job as a child was to go here, there, everywhere, wherever help was needed. She would go and help. If it was fetching water, if it was cleaning or sweeping, if it was minding children, even more complicated things like attending a delivery when there was hardly anyone to deliver a baby. She would go. And so that idea of service, of doing what was sensible, is a very kind of, to me, home idea, an indigenous idea. And I was reminded later when I was a resident and I was telling an elder, not this elder, I was saying to her, we were so busy and emerged tonight. We had 2 chest pains and we had a stroke and we had a motor vehicle accident with 3 people in collars who needed to be assessed. And it was so crazy busy. And then this old lady with diarrhea has the gall to say to me, can you get me a glass of water? Can you imagine? I was so busy and I'm such an important person. I didn't say that part, but that's what I was implying. That she asked me to get some water. And my elder said, maybe she thought you were there to help. So who are Indigenous people? To me, the idea of indigeneity is such a simple concept, and I don't know why it's so difficult for some to wrap their heads around. There are 370 million people who are indigenous by, these are United Nations definitions. They're diverse. They're in over 80 countries, including every continent except Antarctica. Of course, all over the Americas and in Australia, in Polynesia, but also in countries like India and China, Vietnam, and of course in Africa. Indigenous peoples are, very different from each other. They're not genetically similar, for instance, in any way. How they are similar is their social circumstance, that they're original peoples who have been moved for waves of migration. And I know some people hate to hear the idea of migration, but we're people with legs. Moving around is our prerogative. We're not barnacles. So we move, and if any of you have been to a beautiful place, and I've been to many beautiful places that are not my territory, I imagine living there, and I imagine being an immigrant to that place, and what is the responsibility of me? Because the responsibility of being an immigrant, I think, is great. Just like the responsibility of being indigenous to a place is great. That if I went to live in Hawaii, how would I honor Native Hawaiians and their culture and their territory? So original peoples who've been moved over for waves of migration, and very often these people have been moved to the margins of their territories to make way for migrants. That very often they're non-dominant, as in there is another nation who is interfering with their nation's ability to chart its own course. Like residential school, where mothers and fathers are not allowed by law to raise their own children. Whose idea was this? Whose heinous idea was this? And I hear sometimes from people who say, oh, it was a very well-intentioned idea. It was just like a boarding school. And I think, my gosh, that is so naive. So terribly naive, that the removal of these children, and my father went to residential school for a year as a teenager. That's actually where he met my mother, in residential school. But they both wanted to testify at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. They wanted their testimonies recorded. It actually took me years to convince my mother to talk about residential school. I've asked her since I was a boy what it was like. And it wasn't until this year that she said, I was so lonely. But the way she said it was horrible. My father described it as a prison. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission exists in many different countries, and it's a very studied recording and analysis of human rights violations against people, usually state-sanctioned. And certainly in Canada, these human rights violations against children were state-sanctioned. And so the recording of those events, the recording of those testimonials, I think are very important. And they're done. I mean, many of them are done. My parents never, in the end, recorded their testimonial. They got to the archives, because there was an archives portion to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission event that we were at. And in there were photographs. My mother had been to residential school, as I said, from 3 until she was 18, because she left early. She attended early because she had tuberculosis. And there was a TB hospital attached to her residential school. So she went to the hospital, but stayed at the residential school, and then went on into school. But in the archives were unidentified children, photographs of children. And so she sat and she wrote dozens of names of these unidentified children. And she was so happy remembering them. I was horrified. And she would tell me stories about them. She would write their names down. There was a space you could write their names. And she would say, oh, this girl, she had a kitten that she hit. And this girl fell in love with a boy when she was at school. And she would just tell me simple things about them. And I could see her love, which I'd never seen, for her peer group.
was just crazy. Because I know we all think our parents have had hard lives. But, thank you. But the reality of those is hard to embrace. But I'm trying to do it because I think that the experience of our people is part of our looking back. So here's what we know, and we've known this for a long time. Aboriginal people are at the bottom of almost every available index of socioeconomic well-being, educational levels, employment opportunities, housing, per capita incomes, or any of the other conditions that give non-Aboriginal Canadians one of the highest standards of living in the world. That we as Aboriginal people used to own everything, now we own hardly anything, and we're at the very bottom of any ethnic group in the country. And that is partly by design. This commission report was used in a custody battle between an Indigenous parent and a non-Indigenous parent. The lawyer for the non-Indigenous parent quoted the commission as proof that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are unfit places for children to be raised, and they must award custody of this child to the non-Indigenous parent. And so, by speaking to our populations as being poor, impoverished, broken, our poor cousins, is incomplete, and it actually stigmatizes them. It's false, which is why I insist so often in talking about the beauty of where I'm from and the humanity of where I'm from. I could easily, as a public health physician, give you statistics about Aboriginal people and their health outcomes in this country in a number of contexts. But it's far too reductionist, and it actually is a profound disservice. We're also this. So here's my dad, and here are two of my sons. I have 5 sons and a daughter. And my dad is 79. He just turned 79. I'm so lucky to still have him. But last year he said, okay, it's time for my grandsons to visit with me and we'll go hunting. The same thing as when I was a kid. You must know how to hunt in your own territory. You must know where the animals are. You must know how to use these things. You must know that animals die to feed you. It's a basic lesson. So he called them. And these 2 sons, their mom is white. And I said, oh, Papa has called for his grandsons. And she said, so you want my 2 beautiful sons to go out in weather, in the wilderness, with an old man with knives and guns? Someone's going to die. I say no, and I'm the mom, and I decide. And these are 2 very liberal, modern, white lesbians who I've been friends with forever, and I thought we had negotiated this, that these boys were half Indigenous, and that they were from a distinct culture, and that we were going to honor that. But I could see her point. But I knew she was completely wrong. And I'm still trying to reconcile that. But to me, it's a real-world example, and I wanted to say it here, knowing that there would be many parents here, maybe some of you from a different kind of family structure, and you can see that those kinds of cultural dissonance exist, and that we can give voice to them. I can say, I have white lesbian friends, we have children together, I've loved them my entire life. We disagree sometimes, and they really piss me off, and they probably think I'm being a total jerk, because I'm not a parent in the same way that they're parents. Because my boys live with them, and not with me. But I think that kind of schism and clashing of realities is a good metaphor for where we're going, because I do want to talk about two-spirited people and their health and well-being. So, two-spirited people. Two-spirited people is this fairly modern described movement the thought of two spirits within a single body with both feminine and masculine characteristics. And it's a concept that has age-old roots from a number of cultures, including the Lakota and Navajo peoples. Now, it's imperfect. It's imperfect, as in, I think I have feminine qualities. I don't think of myself as having a female spirit completely and utterly. And I think it's perfectly fine to be considered feminine. There's nothing wrong with that. And the binariness of the definition of two-spiritedness is troublesome to me. But it's an idea, and we can hold ideas in our minds at the same time as disagreeing with them, or leaving room and space, maybe even lots of space, to say, it is an incomplete idea, or it's not the totality of my idea of myself, of my identity. But what's very real is this social stigma, this disapproval, this disregard, this contempt even, contempt to death of us as two-spirited, queer, gay, bi, lesbian, trans, bi people. And I feel it racially as well, that sometimes we can be hurt by others' negligence, that others can say, oh, I have a part to play in your well-being. It's like my minister. I have a part to play in your well-being. I don't really want to play that part. And we get that now in Indigenous health. Literally, at our tables, we will have workers say, we don't think you have the capacity to look after yourselves. They don't necessarily say it in exactly those terms. And sometimes they do say it in exactly those terms. You don't have the capacity to look after yourself. Women don't have the capacity to look after women. I'm kind of going further with that idea that gays and lesbians don't have the ability to participate in the health system or to do their own planning, health planning. It's really an odd idea. So when someone says, you don't have the capacity to look after yourselves, it really just galvanizes me to do better. So this sexual stigma is a very, this sexual stigma, often from heterosexual people, but can be from others, is an important idea for us to define. It's literally an obstacle to our wellness. Not just an obstacle to getting care when you're sick, but an obstacle to our wellness, emotionally and mentally, physically, and spiritually. And so we must resist this stigma. And where I come from, I was taught to resist a lot. That to resist is completely normal. That it is completely normal that someone will want to do bad things to you. And it is completely naive to think that you will go through life without ever encountering resistance. That you will go through life without ever meeting a bad person who wants to take things away from you, or who will oppose your existence or those of the ones that you love. And so to resist and to be resilient is a completely normal human capacity, but we have to grow it. So to always speak out, to talk about who we are. And so I do that. You're probably sick of hearing stories about myself, but I do it because there are so few stories about me as a gay father and a professional working in health, that we speak openly. And so I can talk about things like confrontation within my own family, or dissonance with my children or with my parents. I can say that I'm gay and that I'm married, and I really don't care if someone here thinks that that's weird. That I try and show respect and compassion to all of you, because your realities are different. And like David Suzuki says, the infinite faces of humanity, the infinite faces of possibility, means it's actually impossible for us to be the same. We are distinct from one another, and so we must embrace that. And so if you have ideas and actions that are completely foreign and unknown to me, well, that's part of the human experience, and I embrace that. that we create safe and inclusive environments where we could do health planning as gay, lesbian, bi, two-spirited, queer, trans people, and that we focus on our resilience and we focus on our well-being, and not just talk about an illness system where we react when our health is falling away. As First Nations people in a healthcare system, we look after other First Nations people. And as gay, lesbian, bi, trans, two-spirited, queer people, we look after other gay, lesbian, bi, trans, queer, two-spirited people. They're like our cousins, and we must treat them as if they're our cousins. And I would like to hope that if I ever saw any of you in my clinic, that I would treat you extremely kindly, and that every encounter with me would be a respectful one, not one where I'm just giving you whatever baloney I have for that day, that I would say, you're a human being and I'm a human being. Let's do our very best for each other. And I'm out. I try not to translate my experience for others who might have difficulty hearing who I am. I get caught out, though, all the time. I'm very empathetic, so I try and explain to someone who I am in a way that's palatable to them. And then I realize, my gosh, that's quite a lot of work on my part as they sit back from their entitled position and get me to go through my gymnastics routine and say, this is me, this is who I am, and this is how it works. When being out is just saying, I am who I am, this is where I work from. This is supposed to say pride through resistance and resilience. So let's get back to health. We monitor First Nations health in British Columbia. We're very good at it. We monitor First Nations populations in a way that very few provinces are able to, because we have a First Nations client file. We have a way of identifying First Nations clients. We can match it to provincial data, and we can get not only basic incidence and prevalence for disease entities, but we can also look at attached data and look at demographic data, like how old is this cohort, what is their gender, where do they live, what is their indigeneity, are they First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, are they non-status, or are they not, do they live on reserve or off reserve? Largely, our statistics show that First Nations people are getting better slowly. That's considered normal. Our health should be getting better over time as we learn to deal with our circumstances. That healing is completely normal. Getting better is a completely normal process. It would be abnormal and unnatural to not get better. However, there are some health statistics that were dire, that went counter to this, and there were only a few. And HIV and alcohol-related mortality were the most drastic. I'm not going to show you alcohol-related mortality. Suffice to say, First Nations people in British Columbia still have an alcohol-related mortality 5 times the provincial average. Unbelievable mortality statistics, alcohol-related mortality for First Nations people. First Nations people in British Columbia need to talk about alcohol, and they need to talk about it again, and they need to talk about it again. And even though it's stigmatizing, that concept of the drunk Indian is so old and tired, but we mustn't turn our face from that, and we have to have those conversations. But this HIV-related mortality for First Nations people, or for status Indians, and the top line, the top royal blue line, is HIV-related mortality for status Indians from 1993 to 2006. An upward trend for HIV-related mortality. The bottom line, which is other residents of BC who have HIV and their mortality rates, 1993 to 2006, you'll see around 1997, you'll see the trend line, but also see the light blue points for every year. That's the actual mortality rate. And you'll see around 1997 that HIV-related mortality dropped and flatlined with the introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy, a magic pill, what we call in medicine a magic bullet. A pill, a piece of technology, medical technology, that you swallow, and it turned HIV from a fatal disease to a chronic disease that you can apparently live with and live as long as almost anyone else. That medical technology, that magic pill, that magic bullet, was not reaching status Indians. In fact, we were dying faster and more often after the introduction of that magic bullet. That medication is widely available. That medication is free. So what was this? It was very stunning to us that maybe we knew what to do. We had this grand technology. We had really good care. But those pills were not reaching Indigenous mouths. So why was that? What were the obstacles to care? What were the obstacles to delivery? And we had to name them and try and knock them out of the way. And the first one that people came up with was geography. This is Canada. Huge territory. Are people actually physically able to get to a clinic? Are those pills able to arrive at a place near where these people lived? And it's a good question. Of course, we have to ask about geography. But we also had to ask about things like social isolation. Did people feel they could go and get care? Was the clinic a place that they could attend with confidence and feel that they were welcome, that wellness was at the top of the minds of the professionals that they would find there? Or were they worried that they would have a colonizing, disrespectful experience at this clinic? Or did they feel like the clinic wasn't theirs? That clinic's for someone else. Not for me, I don't belong there. It's built for others. And so those were just some of the ideas, and no one's really studied this very, very closely to find an evidence base for what those actual obstacles are. All we can do is guess. We can just guess. But my feeling is that homophobia and racism has a little part to play in there. It has some part to play in there. That maybe our status Indians with HIV were fearful that someone was not going to be very nice to them in the care center. And that meant that we as healthcare workers had some learning to do. We weren't just going to place it all on the client. So we've been looking at First Nations people with HIV for a while. I'm going to give you some current statistics. Some of them are a little bit older, but I will give you a picture at the very least. So for Aboriginal HIV treatment access in British Columbia as of April 2015, 1,433 self-identified Aboriginal people have ever been on treatment. 917 of them are still alive, and 770 of them are currently on treatment. And that in the cascade of care, like if we look at the individual little boxes, so of those who are HIV positive, how many of them were linked to care? That's the first that first column of figures. How many were actually retained in care? And then the next set is how many on antiretroviral therapy. The next grouping is how many were adherent or stayed adherent. And then how many were virally suppressed. And the last column is how many are completely suppressed or suppressed overall. And you can see from 2007, 2009, 2011, the trends that were marginally getting better and better over time in British Columbia dealing with First Nations people. But there's lots of room for improvement. You should be seeing a lot of engagement over time, like from 2007 to 2011. Those columns should be taller every 2 years. And those columns should all be tall, and those columns should all be the same size. But they're not. There's a lot that we can do within the cascade of care still for First Nations people, in spite of all of our efforts. There's still more to be done. And I'm not sure how this province is doing in engaging First Nations people with HIV. The fact that we even have a First Nation specific focus, I think, that is all of our concern, or the concern of all HIV workers in BC, is new and interesting. This is the cascade among First Nations persons for 2011, just to show you, before I get to the current data, comparing non-First Nations people in green to First Nations people in blue. And of course, ideally, those columns would be the same height. And you see that as you move from left to right, that the proportion grows, the dissonance between the two columns grows as you get to suppressed overall. And you can see that suppressed overall for First Nations is significantly lower than for non-First Nations persons with HIV in British Columbia. This is the First Nations cascade by gender. Females in green, males in blue. In most of the population, persons with HIV, men, are blue, usually much, much higher than for women. In British Columbia, very, very close. Fairly equal numbers of women versus men with HIV who are First Nations in BC. Maybe the same here. Maybe. Maybe the same for all Indigenous populations in Canada. This is the cascade among First Nations by a selected health authority. We wanted to do this because we thought maybe the place of residence of First Nations people with HIV played a part in their outcomes. So if you were living downtown, like in Vancouver Coastal Health, which is in green, what were your outcomes compared to if you lived in the north? And our north is fairly remote, even though it's British Columbia, it's still a fairly remote north. That's in blue. And you can see them compared to each other. And you can see the north does not as well as downtown, Vancouver. And we used interior as kind of maybe a suburban-like environment. And actually, their outcomes are fairly good. We wondered if they would be worse. We wondered if living in an area where there wasn't a strong focus on HIV would have a negative impact on your health and well-being. And that wasn't the case. That was at least reassuring. But for us, as First Nations people, we see that there's work to do in remote areas as well as with our downtown population. And we have a lot of First Nations people with HIV who live downtown. They're a very significant presence. There are hundreds of First Nations people with HIV who live in Vancouver. Now here's a look at risk. And I just want to show you the bright green part, IV drug users. When we're looking at First Nations and HIV, they're the lion's share. So how are we working with IV drug users in BC? IV drug users who are First Nations? Well, we do have some efforts, and I'll describe those. This is a cascade, and I'm almost finished this part with the graphics, because I know these reductionist graphics are a little bit of a pain to read. You look at them and go, what the heck is that? You're going to make me work. This is the cascade for First Nations persons with IVDU history as a risk factor for HIV, showing that IVD users in blue, by the time you get to suppressed overall, are not doing as well as non-IVD users with HIV. I call that compelling distractions within the life of the IV drug users that makes it difficult for them to attain care. So, to summarize, in 2011, amongst all First Nations people diagnosed, 70% IVD users compared to 35% among non-First Nations in this known risk group, and that among First Nations, reduced rates of adherence and suppression. So there's more we can do around wraparound care. This is not startling news. I think we suspected all of this, but we can actually name it in BC. Providence Healthcare has a number of initiatives. Providence is downtown Vancouver. They have a number of initiatives to address First Nations, people with HIV who are IVD users. And here are a few of them. And I'll leave this PowerPoint so you can look on these links. Just so that you know, we've seen the evidence and we are reacting. And just a reminder of the HIV cascade of care for First Nations and non-First Nations people. First Nations in blue, non-First Nations in that orangey yellow color. These are our statistics for 2014. This is our data for 2014. The fact that we get this kind of surveillance data has been a lot of work. I know it's hard for you to remember what I showed you from 2011 and 2009 and 2007. Basically, hardly anything has changed. Very quickly, cascade of care for MSMs. Cascade of care for IVD users. Oh, and if you put them together with the cascade of care for First Nations people, you can see that success rate for virally suppressed overall, 72% for MSMs, 58% for IVD users who are non-Aboriginal, and 31% for First Nations people with HIV, in spite of all of our work. Cascade of care. Linked to care, retained in care on HIV medication, taking medication as prescribed, lower undetectable virus in blood. And those are our streams that we're spending time working on. So, Stigma. This is a publicity campaign that we did in one of our small health authorities. It's a picture of me and my husband. My health is how I show my love. We're trying to draw people into care and draw people into thinking about HIV and draw people into testing, routine testing, and we're trying to do it in a different way. And as someone said to me, oh, it's such a relief to see, guys who aren't young and hot in your HIV campaign. I still feel sad about that. Of course, LGBT and two-spirited health is way more than HIV, and I just want to spend 2 slides on that we have to be considering the holistic elements of health and well-being. We have to think about our mental health. We have to think about substance use, tobacco use. We have to think about nutrition and our weight, a healthy weight, healthy physical activity, body image, and many other issues, and that we, as those health planners, need to include LGBT and two-spirited peoples in that planning. We have STIs, we have issues of bullying, self-esteem, we have violence against women, particularly against Indigenous women and trans women, intimate partner violence, self-harm, homophobia, cancer, but also the social determinants of health, health status and self-rated health, their happiness with the system, cultural health and well-being, and the concepts of the healthy family and healthy community. In fact, in New Zealand, they're moving away, the Maori people of New Zealand are moving away from an individualized institutional focus on health and looking more towards family and community focus that's community-based. So rather than looking at things from an institutional viewpoint that focuses on the client, they want to take a community-based focus to family. So, in British Columbia, we have the First Nations Health Authority. The First Nations Health Authority has the authority and resources to serve First Nations people. We're a First Nations health service organization that has taken over from Health Canada's responsibility to First Nations and Inuit health. And we serve the people. And I put this up, it just shows a number of our agreements. We formally agreed to do something about health disparities between Indigenous peoples and other British Columbians. And that these formal agreements mean commitments, and they mean work plans, and it means quite a large team. There are actually 500 of us now who work in the First Nations Health Authority, and these are apart from the workers who are already on the ground in community. These are 500 new workers who look at First Nations health. And we realize that people are watching how we do, and so we're working really hard to make sure that we come up with whatever is required to do our very best. And so we're unapologetic in our approach, which is a wellness approach. So rather than thinking of disease, we're thinking of wellness. And so HIV must be thought of, and two-spiritedness must be thought of from a wellness context, that we participate in wellness as in we are part of the well-being of people. We're part of their family that gives wellness. We don't just give service when the going gets tough. We don't just give service when someone is sick or in trouble. We're not removed from them. We're not involved in transactions with our clients. They're our family, and we treat them like they're our family. That we together have well-being. We together are happy. We together are resilient, as opposed to us stooping to help those who are less fortunate on the other side of town. One of the things that we talk about a lot is governance. Who's in charge of what? So we know that there are lots of health challenges, issues with time, issues with resources, issue with really sick people. The need is constant. We have all of that, just the same as you. And so we talk about who's in charge of cancer, who's in charge of this extreme case, who's in charge of trans women. So we talk about it. In certain cases, it's very clear. In BC, cancer is run by the BC Cancer Agency. The province is the lead, and we follow. We're not asking for a First Nations Cancer Agency. We're not asking for small villages to run their own mini cancer centers. No, cancer is run by the BC Cancer Agency. But when it comes to things like aspirin for grandma, and before we used to apply to Ottawa to get aspirin to grandma, a very time-consuming, very expensive, bureaucratic, non-evidence-based approach to getting grandma aspirin. And we've said, well, we think the local health workers can do that. Let them do that. But what about some of the other stuff? Well, we were negotiating. I just want to tell a quick story. We had a baby who died, sudden infant death syndrome. First Nations baby in a community. SIDS is a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning that we don't know how baby died. There's nothing in the pathology to indicate what happened. Probably multifactorial, probably lots of issues contributing to the baby dying spontaneously and unexpectedly in the home under 1 year. The community wanted this baby's body returned to them in a timely fashion so that the baby could be buried within a certain time parameter. And the community, or the parents had been told that the baby's brain and brainstem would be removed and kept for sectioning and would be returned to them in 9 weeks. So parts of the baby had been removed, were going to be kept, and that the family would have to deal with how to deal with those body parts when they were returned to them. So we were having a discussion. How does this work? Does this have to happen? This is egregious. This is very invasive. It's not within our cultural practice. Can we get a better service? The chief coroner, who ultimately was very sympathetic, the chief coroner said, well, you know, by law, literally by law, by the BC Coroners Act, I'm allowed to keep this body as long as I see fit in order to determine a cause of death. And the chief slammed his fist on the table and said, yeah, we know you think you're in charge, but we think this is our baby. We think this is our family. And it never struck home in all of those hundreds of meetings why the patient voice is so important, why we're important in our own health and well-being, and why we must empower others. Because, of course, these are their babies. These are their bodies. And it was such an important moment for me to see that in action and to remind myself that the patient voice isn't just a nicety. It's absolutely necessary. And that our governance of our own bodies that we've all fought so hard for as queer, gay, lesbian, bi, trans, two-spirited people is very real. And we must keep possession of our bodies. And we must keep possession of our health and well-being. I want to end with a couple of more thoughts. A gardener's tale. Dr. Camara Jones. The gardener notices that pink flowers flourish while red flowers languish or don't grow as tall, but has forgotten her original decision to separate the seeds into two types of soil, one rich and one poor. And instead she thinks, I was right to prefer pink over red. And so let me be clear that we're the gardeners. and we grow ourselves and our families and each other and our clients, and we must look after all the flowers, not just the ones that are growing tallest and straightest and that live in the richest soil. Let's make things right in the garden. Let's make things right for all of us. And as my elder was saying to me, and I still hear it, our job is not to be big, fancy, important, smart people. Our job is to be the best human being possible. So I urge all of you towards that. Thank you.